My name is DeShawn Williams, and I'm telling you this from my dorm room at Howard University, where I'm a senior majoring in criminal justice with plans to become a public defender fighting the same system that tried to destroy my life when I was 15 years old. At 22, I should be celebrating my upcoming graduation and law school acceptance. But instead, I'm haunted by the knowledge that most of my middle school classmates never made it this far. Not because they lacked intelligence or potential, but because our underfunded school in North Philadelphia was designed to funnel black and brown students toward juvenile detention centers and adult prisons rather than high school diplomas and college campuses. My escape from the school-to-prison pipeline was the result of one teacher's intervention and my family's fierce advocacy, but it came after a year in juvenile detention that nearly destroyed my faith in education and my belief in my own worth as a human being deserving of opportunity rather than punishment. I grew up in Strawberry Mansion, a neighborhood where poverty and systemic divestment had created conditions that made academic success nearly impossible for students who were already fighting against multiple disadvantages before they ever entered classroom. My elementary school, Samuel Fells, was a crumbling building with broken windows, leaking roofs, and textbooks so outdated that they still showed the Soviet Union on world maps. We had no art classes, no music program, no advanced academic courses, and no college counselors who could help students envision futures beyond the immediate struggle for survival that characterized daily life in our community. The disciplinary culture at Fells was based on zero-tolerance policies that criminalized normal childhood behavior while providing no support services for students who were dealing with trauma, poverty, family instability, or learning differences that affected their ability to conform to rigid behavioral expectations. Students were suspended for minor infractions like talking back to teachers, being late to class, or having their phones visible during school hours. The punishment was always exclusion from educational opportunities rather than intervention or support that might address underlying issues affecting student behavior and academic performance. My first encounter with the school-to-prison pipeline occurred in 7th grade when I was suspended for 3 days for disrespecting a teacher after I questioned why our science class was using textbooks from 1987 that didn't include basic information about modern technology or environmental science. Mrs. Patterson, my science teacher, interpreted my question as argumentative behavior and sent me to the principal's office, where I was immediately suspended without any investigation into the context of my comment or consideration of whether academic curiosity might be something to encourage rather than punish. The suspension meant missing 3 days of instruction in all subjects, putting me behind in coursework, while also sending the message that questioning educational inadequacy was a punishable offense rather than evidence of critical thinking skills that should be developed and supported. When I returned to school, I was labeled as a problem student whose academic questions were now viewed as potential disruption rather than engagement with learning. The disciplinary file that was created during my suspension would follow me throughout my educational experience and influence how future teachers and administrators perceive my behavior and potential. The escalation continued in 8th grade when the school district implemented a zero-tolerance policy for any behavior that could be interpreted as threatening, disruptive, or disrespectful to authority figures. The policy was accompanied by increased security measures, including metal detectors, surveillance cameras, and the presence of police officers in school hallways who were authorized to make arrests for violations that would have been handled as disciplinary matters in schools serving more affluent, predominantly white populations. The presence of police in our school fundamentally changed the educational environment from a place of learning to a place of surveillance and control. Students were constantly watched for signs of potential trouble. Teachers were encouraged to report behavioral concerns to security rather than addressing them educationally, and normal adolescent behavior was increasingly criminalized through arrests and referrals to juvenile court rather than handled through school-based interventions or support services. My arrest occurred during lunch period in October of my 8th grade year, when I was involved in a verbal argument with another student about a basketball game that had taken place the previous weekend. The argument was typical teenage disagreement that involved raised voices and animated gestures, but no physical contact or threats of violence. In previous years, such disputes would have been handled by teachers or administrators who would separate the students, require them to cool down, and perhaps assign detention or community service if any rules had been violated. Instead, Officer Patricia Morrison, The police officer assigned to our school witnessed the argument and decided that our aggressive behavior constituted disorderly conduct that warranted arrest. Within minutes, I found myself handcuffed in the school hallway while students watched in shock and fear as their classmate was criminalized for behavior that occurred in every middle school in America, but was only treated as criminal when it involved black students in underfunded urban schools. The booking process of the Juvenile Detention Center was my first experience with the criminal justice system that would dominate the next year of my life and nearly destroy my educational trajectory permanently. I was fingerprinted, photographed, and processed like an adult criminal despite being 14 years old and having committed no crime other than being a black teenager in a school system that had been designed to criminalize rather than educate students who look like me. The juvenile court hearing was scheduled 3 weeks after my arrest, during which time I was suspended from school and prohibited from returning to campus, pending resolution of the criminal charges. The suspension meant missing crucial instruction time during a period when I should have been preparing for high school placement exams and exploring academic opportunities that might set me up for future success. Instead, I was home with nothing to do except worry about potential juvenile detention placement and wonder whether my educational future had been destroyed by a lunch period argument. The public defender assigned to my case, Attorney Michael Jones, was overworked and had 15 minutes to review my file before my first court appearance. He advised me to accept a plea agreement that would result in probation and community service rather than risk juvenile detention through a trial that might result in a harsher sentence if I was found guilty. The plea would also create a permanent juvenile record that could affect my future educational and employment opportunities. But Attorney Jones explained that this was the best deal available given the charges and the court's typical handling of school-based arrests. My grandmother, Rose Williams, who had raised me since my mother died when I was 8, refused to accept the plea agreement and insisted on hiring private attorney David Rodriguez, who specialized in juvenile cases involving school discipline. Attorney Rodriguez immediately recognized that my case reflected systematic problems with school-to-prison pipeline practices rather than legitimate criminal behavior that warranted court intervention. He began building a defense that challenged the criminalization of normal adolescent behavior, while also advocating for my return to educational opportunities that had been denied through suspension and court proceedings. The investigation revealed that Samuel Fells had suspended or arrested over 400 students during the previous academic year, a rate that was 10 times higher than schools serving predominantly white populations in the same district. The disparities were particularly striking when comparing behavioral infractions that resulted in suspension or arrest at our school versus counseling or alternative interventions at more affluent schools, where similar behaviors were treated as developmental issues rather than criminal matters. The expert testimony in my case included Dr. Sarah Martinez, an educational researcher who had studied school discipline disparities and could explain how zero-tolerance policies disproportionately affected Black and Latino students while providing no educational benefits and significant harm to academic outcomes. Her research showed that students who were suspended or arrested for minor infractions were significantly more likely to drop out of school, repeat grades, and become involved in the juvenile justice system, creating a pipeline from educational institutions to incarceration facilities. The media attention that surrounded my case brought public scrutiny to disciplinary practices at Samuel Fells and other schools in the district that were criminalizing student behavior rather than providing educational support and intervention. Local newspapers reported on the disparities in suspension and arrest rates between schools serving different racial and economic populations, creating pressure for policy changes that might address systematic discrimination in school discipline procedures. The community organizing that emerged around my case included parents, students, and advocates who have been fighting against school-to-prison pipeline practices for years, but had struggled to generate public attention and political support for reform efforts. My case provided a specific example of how these policies affected individual students and families, giving advocates concrete evidence to support their arguments for alternative approaches to school discipline and student support. The legal victory came 6 months after my arrest when Judge Maria Rodriguez dismissed all charges against me and ordered the school district to provide educational services that would help me recover academically from the time lost during suspension and court proceedings. She also ordered the district to review their disciplinary policies and consider alternative approaches that emphasize education and support rather than punishment and exclusion. The educational recovery required intensive tutoring and summer school programs to make up for the instruction time I had missed during suspension and court proceedings. Mrs. Angela Thompson, a teacher at a nearby high school who had volunteered to provide tutoring support, became a crucial mentor who helped me understand that my intelligence and potential hadn't been diminished by my experience with the criminal justice system. She encouraged me to view education as a form of resistance against systems that were designed to limit my opportunities and help me develop academic skills that would prepare me for high school success. The high school transition was challenging because my juvenile arrest record followed me despite the charges being dismissed, creating assumptions about my character and potential that I had to constantly overcome through academic performance and positive behavior. Some teachers and administrators viewed me as a potential troublemaker who required extra surveillance, while others recognized that I had been victimized by systematic problems and provided additional support to help me succeed academically. The academic excellence that I achieved in high school was partly motivated by my determination to prove that students from underfunded schools could succeed when given appropriate opportunities and support. I graduated valedictorian from my high school with a full scholarship to Howard University, but the success felt bittersweet because most of my middle school classmates hadn't been as fortunate in escaping the school-to-prison pipeline that had nearly destroyed my own educational trajectory. The college experience at Howard provided opportunities to study the systematic issues that had affected my education and to understand how policy changes might prevent other students from experiencing similar criminalization and educational disruption. My criminal justice major focused specifically on juvenile justice reform and school discipline policies that could address pipeline practices, while also providing educational opportunities for students who had been excluded from traditional academic settings. The research I conducted for my senior thesis documented the long-term outcomes for students who had been suspended or arrested at Samuel Fells during the same period when I was criminalized for normal adolescent behavior. The findings were devastating. Over 60% had dropped out of high school, 40% had been arrested as adults, and fewer than 10% had pursued post-secondary education. The pipeline had functioned exactly as designed, transforming educational institutions into feeder systems for incarceration facilities. The advocacy work that emerged from my research included partnerships with organizations like the Advancement Project and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that were fighting against school-to-prison pipeline practices through litigation, policy advocacy, and community organizing. I provided testimony for legislative hearings about school discipline reform and shared my story at conferences where educators, policymakers, and advocates were working to develop alternative approaches to student support and behavioral intervention. The law school applications I submitted included personal statements about my experience with the juvenile justice system and my commitment to becoming a public defender who could represent other young people facing criminalization for behavior that should be handled educationally rather than through the courts. Several law schools specifically recruited me because of my background and perspective on criminal justice issues affecting minority communities. Today, as I prepare for law school and a career fighting the same system that nearly destroyed my life, I remain connected to current students at Samuel Fells who are facing similar challenges with school discipline and educational inequality. I provide mentoring support and advocate for policy changes that might give them better opportunities than what was available during my own middle school experience. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. The Advancement Project works on policy reform to eliminate school-to-prison pipeline practices and advocates for educational approaches that support student success rather than criminalizing normal adolescent behavior. Juvenile justice reform organizations provide legal representation for students facing school-based arrests and work on systematic changes to reduce unnecessary criminalization of educational issues. Restorative justice programs in schools offer alternatives to suspension and arrest that focus on repairing harm, building community, and addressing underlying issues that affect student behavior and academic performance. Educational advocacy organizations work on school funding equity, teacher training, and policy changes that can improve academic opportunities in underfunded schools serving minority communities. Legal aid organizations provide representation for students and families dealing with school discipline issues and work on civil rights cases that challenge discriminatory practices in educational settings. Mentoring programs connect successful professionals with students who are navigating educational challenges and provide support for academic achievement and college preparation. Community organizing efforts engage parents, students, and advocates in campaigns for educational equity and alternatives to punitive discipline policies that harm student outcomes. Policy research organizations document the impact of school-to-prison pipeline practices and provide evidence-based recommendations for educational and juvenile justice reforms. Today, when I meet young people who are facing school discipline issues or feeling like the educational system is working against them, I tell them that their intelligence and potential can't be diminished by policies that are designed to limit their opportunities. Education is a form of resistance, and academic success is the best response to systems that expect you to fail. There are people and organizations fighting for educational equity and criminal justice reform, and your voice and experience are crucial for creating change. The pipeline is real, but so is your power to overcome it and help others escape it too.